Friends, we are listening the book called as The Long Pilgrimage. This book consists of the life and the teachings of Sri shivapuribaba. In this part, we are going to start the chapter 1. Title is The Quest. Here we are going to listen about the life, about the journey, and about certain principles which were existing at the base of preparation of the life of shivapuribaba. Let us start. In the year of grace 1826, George the Fourth was King of England. A 7-year-old girl living obscurely in Kensington Palace was 11 years later to become Queen Victoria. George Canning had for some years as Foreign Secretary been working to convert his country from the role of defender of the ancient privileges to that of champion of the new liberties. During that time, the conquest of India had just been completed by the Maratha and the Burmese War, and the subcontinent was for the first time since Aurangzeb united under rulers of an alien race. Fortunately, the British did not reproduce the merciless intolerance of the last great Mughal. In the same year 1826, a very great Indian, Ram Mohan Roy, was successful in securing the support of the British Raj for reforms that were within less than 1.5 centuries to produce modern India. He was already in that year planning the Brahma Samaj, a spiritual movement which sought to unite Hinduism and Christianity. Outwardly, the world was at peace and full of hope for the future. But there was everywhere a current of unease. Prophecies of the early end of the age found ready hearers in many parts of the world. In India, at least the traditional beliefs and customs were well established. The Varnashram Dharma, or regulation of life by castes and stages, was especially in the southern India so firmly entrenched that even a reformer as bold as Ram Mohan Roy made no attempt to fight it. Such was the world and such was India, when in 1826 a Brahmin family in the state of Kerala was awakened to rejoice in the birth of twin children, a boy and a girl. The family belonged to the clan of sub-caste of the Nambudiris of the highest and purest Brahmin descent. The grandfather of the twin children Achyutam was known far and wide as a great astrologer to whom Brahmins and princes used to visit often to seek advices. These advices were upon the vital problems on which Indians to this day seek guidance from the planets. A family profoundly religious and rooted in tradition and little touched by the upheavals that were but recently rife in the north and the central India. When the baby boy was born, he smiled even as he drew his first breath. He was brought to his grandfather, who announced that the signs of his birth and the smile signified that a great sannyasi had come into the world, and that his family line would come to an end as it had fulfilled its purpose on earth. The early part of his life followed the usual course. At 5, he entered upon the ashram or stage of studentship called as brahmacharya, and by the time he was 12, he had mastered the four principal Vedas and the two subsidiary works, the Dhanurveda and the Ayurveda. His grandfather was his guru, and he completed his student period by about 1840 when he was 14 years old. Achyutam had meanwhile entered the third phase of his life, called as the Vanaprastha or hermit, and decided to retire to the forest far from his home. At the age of 18, that is in 1844, the young Brahmin decided to abandon the world. He made a will entitling his twin sister to inherit their paternal property and followed his grandfather to the forest. The future Edward VII was a 3-year-old baby in Buckingham Palace. The great Indian saint of the 19th century, Ramakrishna Paramahans, was 10 years old and was about to enter the first of his great spiritual ecstasies. The young Brahmin was leaving a world already troubled, though few could have foreseen the upheavals of the next 10 years. Soon after, he joined his grandfather in the forest on the banks of the Narmada River in the upper Deccan. He began to prepare himself for his vocation as a sannyasi. In the Vedic religion, as codified in the great law books of Manu, Gautam, and Vasishtha, there are two ways of perfection which are laid open to man. One is the way of the four ashrams or stages of life. This consists in the fulfillment of the duties of a householder, the begetting and the training of sons to follow him, the establishment of a family, and the performance of all the elaborate ritual that is incumbent upon the priestly caste of Brahmins. And these duties require some 42 years for their accomplishment. At the age of 63, the grand climacteric, the Brahman householder has seen his sons grow to man's estate, his daughters' families established, and his religious duties transferred to his eldest son and heir. He is then a free man. He may then retire to the forest or other solitary place, accompanied by his wife if she is still alive. This third stage of life enables him to prepare himself for the abandonment of all earthly ties. When he feels himself ready, he enters the fourth state, that of sannyasi, and either remains in the forest or wanders from village to village, supported by the alms joyfully offered wherever he goes. Such is the normal life. To those who discover in themselves a sufficiently firm resolution to abandon everything from the start, a second way is open. They can cut out the periods as householder and forest dweller and enter directly upon the final stage of abandonment of the world. For this way also, rules have long been established in India. They are mainly due to the great reformer of the time, Shankaracharya, who lived from 780 to 820 AD. And he founded 12 orders of sannyasi in all parts of India. At the present time, there are four main divisions, each with its own monastery, headed by a spiritual leader bearing the name of the founder, Shankaracharya. Each of the orders bears a name shared by all sannyasi belonging to it. Ramakrishna Paramahans was initiated in the East by Totapuri, and all monks of his order bear the name of Puri. The northern sannyasins are Saraswatis and the western Giri. The future shivapuribaba waited for the death of his grandfather before taking his final vows. When preparing for the death, his grandfather told him that he had set aside a large sum in the form of diamonds and other precious stones which he was to guard until he had attained Jivan Mukti or God realization. Then, in accordance with the tradition established by the example of Shankaracharya himself, he would have to make a pilgrimage all around the world. This had always been interpreted to mean a pilgrimage on foot to the four corners of India, visiting all the holy places and returning to his birthplace. In his case, the pilgrimage round the world, said his grandfather, was to be taken literally, and for this reason he had prepared a large sum of money to enable him to accomplish this journey, so that he can travel freely in countries where wandering sannyasins were not yet known. When the young sannyasi had buried his grandfather and completed all obligatory duties on his behalf, the young man set out to visit the Shankara Mutt of the south and receive his initiation as a sannyasi. And there the young sannyasi took the name of Govindananda Bharati. Speaking of this, 𝘄𝗶𝗹𝗹 said that this initiation was not necessary for him, as he knew what he had to do, but he accepted it as an act of social order. After this initiation, the young sannyasi then set out into the jungle that stretched at that time for hundreds of miles along the banks of the Narmada river. In the final stages of the journey, he did not meet another human being for 14 days. The place he finally selected was in the depth of the Narmada forest, protected from the chance visitors by deep, impenetrable forest. And there he could find the self-grown food he needed to maintain life, the only external obligation that remains to the sannyasi during his period of complete seclusion. The path that Govindananda intended to follow was that of Ritambhara Pragya, or absolute realization of God beyond all forms and beyond all images. This is reached by stages which are recognizably similar to those followed by the great contemplatives. No one can start from the end, that is, from the contemplation of God as absolute will beyond being itself. To reach Ritambhara Pragya, there must be a progressive elimination of all that can support and comfort the mind. Only when all is stripped away and the soul enters the absolute nakedness that is beyond consciousness and beyond understanding can it make that final act of pure will whereby all distinctions disappear and the individual and the absolute are made one. On the way to the absolute, there are stages of relative perfection, each accompanied by its own mode of God realization. As each is attained, it is to be rejected as soon as it becomes apparent that any separation still remains. How many times did the future saint encounter God only to plunge more deeply into the unknowable abyss? Year after year passed, Govindanand tells us that he soon lost the count of time. In the Indian forest, the years can pass with no outward signs but the dry and wet seasons, and even the monsoon rains passed unnoticed by the sannyasi who has withdrawn his attention from the natural order of life. It is easy to write that he spent more than 20 years in total solitude except for the wild animals who had become his friends and the only companions. It is not at all easy for those of us Europeans who have perhaps longed to be alone for a time but never achieved even a month's complete solitude to picture to ourselves the effect upon a sensitive soul of such a life passed during the years of greatest natural vigor between 25 and 48 years of age. To live only upon the roots, fruits, and wild grains may be very healthy, and no doubt one would soon get used to it. And to remain alone for a quarter of a century without exchanging a word with another human being must indeed call for a strong and pure mind, if it is to be born without loss of sanity. It seems to me that the hardest part must be to spend year after year without any certainty as to when and even whether the final enlightenment, the beatific vision, would be granted. Most of us can bear constance of a time or for a time, it is when we have no assurance of relief that our courage is tried beyond endurance. Now, we'll stop for the part 3. Hope, 𝘁𝗶𝗹𝗹, slowly creating space in the heart of the listeners, and hope that the story of him is creating something beautiful inside all of you. Thank you so much to listen this part. Still many more parts left with this journey called as the long pilgrimage, where we spend time with life and the teachings of Sri 𝘁𝗶𝗹𝗹. Thank you so much.